All right, well, it's 6:03, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. If I start breaking up or freezing up, I will mute my video and you'll just have to listen to me. We'll pretend it's a podcast. But thank you all for joining us tonight, and really looking forward to spending the next 10 Tuesdays with everybody talking about targeted grazing. We're excited to have this opportunity. My name is Dan Macon. I am a livestock and natural resources advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra region. And I will ask the other folks who are part of our core instructor team to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So, Julie, why don't you go next?
Sure. So, like Dan, I'm a livestock and natural resources advisor. I work in Kern, Tulare, and Kings counties with UC Cooperative Extension. Morgan, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Like Julie and Dan, I'm also a livestock natural resources advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. I cover the counties of Sacramento, Yolo, Solano, and Napa counties. And I'll pass it on to Beth.
Hello, good evening. Beth Reynolds, and I'm a targeted grazer in San Luis Obispo County, and I will be talking tonight about that. I also teach at Cal Poly State University in the Animal Science Department.
We're really happy to have Beth with us tonight. Rosie.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Rosie Bush. I'm a sheep and goat extension veterinarian for UC Cooperative Extension, and I'm based out of UC Davis. I have a statewide appointment, and I'm excited to be here and listen and learn with you all and get to share some of our experiences as well.
And Allison from over at Hopland.
Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Smith. I'm the shepherd and animal department head over at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, which is part of the University of California, part of the division that does cooperative extension.
And we have one of our core instructors who's not able to be here tonight, but you'll hear from her next week. Katie Lowe is our statewide fire program director and has been part of this as well. So thank you all for being here. And I think we'll jump into these slides. If you need to interrupt me and tell me that I'm breaking up or cutting out, I will mute my picture, but so far so good. All right, so we've introduced ourselves, but we do want to start by asking all of you to introduce yourselves as well and just briefly name where you're from and do you currently have a targeted grazing business? And then we'll jump through and do a short course interview overview and also and then jump into our introduction. There will be very easy homework, but we will try each week to provide you with some additional reading that will help with additional information about the topics that we're covering. And so that'll be at the end of the presentation tonight. I want to just give you a quick overview of what we've got coming ahead. We'll talk about wildfire and fuels, landscape evaluation next week. Then we'll go through small ruminant nutrition. We'll have a section on resource management and conservation, livestock health and well-being, tools and technology. Because we're talking small ruminants, we'll have a workshop on coexisting with wildlife. We'll have economics and business management and breeding and genetics. And then we'll end up with working with grant-funded projects. And I see, Martin, you're able to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank God for the better half. El Dorado County cattle rancher, and I'm a semi-retired ag infrastructure general contractor. And we have our own herd, and we've been doing invasive managed grazing for about 20 years for quite a few different ranchers.
Excellent. Welcome. And I'm glad you're able to join us. I do also want to put a plug in for our field day at UC Davis. We'll have more details on that as we go through the spring. But I hope you can plan to be there. It is on a Saturday, and everybody that's able to come for that field day will be entered in a drawing for either a gift certificate or equipment from Livewire Products up in Penn Valley. And you'll also get the new Targeted Grazing 101 book put out by the American Sheep Industry. So unless there are any questions, I think we'll dive in and do a quick overview of targeted grazing, and then we'll get to Beth Reynolds tonight. So the big things we're going to talk about today is that it's not just for goats anymore, that targeted grazing is really a management system as opposed to a particular type of livestock. We'll talk a little bit about where it fits in with other vegetation management tools, with probably some special emphasis on fire and fuel reduction. We'll talk about how important it is to know the plants that are in your landscape, what your animals will eat, and why they won't eat it in some cases, including invasive and toxic plants. Talk very briefly about the importance of genetics and animal health in terms of the animal component of targeted grazing. And then we'll spend some time on grazing management principles, on infrastructure, and on the economics. And we'll have some additional resources at the end of the talk. So I want to start just with this idea that there's a spectrum of grazing that really runs from kind of conventional grazing that is production focused, clear up to targeted grazing. And if we think about production grazing, production focused grazing, you know, it occurs on over 30 million acres in the state of California. But the real focus is to be producing beef or lamb or wool, and the vegetation management benefits are incidental to the fact that those animals are removing vegetation. Prescribed grazing may also be focused on production goals, but those vegetation management goals might be part of the grazing plan. So if you think about grazing on a Forest Service allotment, where part of the focus and part of the plan is to maintain certain types of vegetation in mountain meadows, for example, that would be considered prescribed grazing. Targeted grazing really shifts the whole focus of grazing from livestock production to vegetation management. And we'll spend some time tonight talking about why that's so important and what that means in terms of managing our animals and managing landscapes. The definition from the Targeted Grazing Handbook is that it's the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish defined vegetation or landscape goals. The major difference between good grazing management and targeted grazing is that targeted grazing refocuses the outputs of grazing from livestock production to vegetation and landscape enhancement. Grazing and prescribed fire are really the only fuels management tools that actually remove vegetation. If you think about the other things that we can do to alter fuel in particular, whether it's herbicide or mechanical treatment, mowing, those all change how the vegetation is on the landscape, but they don't actually remove it. And grazing and fire are really important in that regard. So if we think about how these tools fit, particularly in terms of fuels management, you know, grazing removes fuels, as we said, it modifies the fuel profile. So when we graze livestock across a pasture, we're trampling and defecating and urinating on that forage as well as consuming it. And that changes the fuel profile in some cases very significantly. And we can use grazing across a wide range of topographic, land ownership, land use, and ecological constraints. Prescribed fire can be a great tool, but there are some constraints with how and where we can use it in California. And certainly with mechanical treatment or hand treatment or herbicides, there are some limitations there as well. Now, Beth's probably never had this happen, but I have had a flock of sheep and goats escape. And I bought lots of landscaping plants, but I didn't have to replace anybody's home. And I think that's one of the other differences in terms of how we can use grazing, in particular in the wildland urban interface. So what's the difference at an operational scale between targeted grazing and livestock production? And there's a couple of key things that I think are important to keep in mind here in terms of why we get paid to do targeted grazing. First, in terms of the flock characteristics, we may have a mixed flock, we may have mixed age classes. In some cases, we may have some older castrated males that we can impact lower quality vegetation with. But the focus is really on assimilating a group of animals that can meet our vegetation or landscape management goals. If we're in livestock production, typically we're going to run breeding animals and replacement animals separately. We are marketing the castrated males and some of the replacement females to generate income. That's how a livestock business generates economic activity. The primary income stream for a targeted grazing operation is typically going to be grazing contracts. Morgan and Julie and I have done some work developing a cost study for targeted grazing and really have some solid estimates as to what proportion of that those operations earn their income from grazing contracts versus the sale of lambs and kids. That can be an important secondary income stream, and hopefully Beth will talk a little bit about that, but it's not the primary focus. That's not to say that a livestock producer might not do some seasonal targeted grazing when they have a group of animals that doesn't have high nutritional demand. And I think that's the real key here. The management emphasis in a targeted grazing business is to maximize the days on paid contracts. We're often using very high stock densities to impact vegetation, not only by grazing or browsing, but by trampling and other impacts as well. And as a consequence to that, we may accept some nutritional stress. That nutritional stress can translate directly to lower conception or weaning weights. And so if your income stream is dependent entirely on the number of calves or the number of lambs or kids that you have to sell, you want to be really focused on optimal nutrition during those key reproduction phases. Any questions on that before we move on? So when I was doing targeted grazing, I always thought it would be really great to have playing cards, primarily for law enforcement because they didn't know a sheep from a goat often. But I think it's also important to think about the right animals for the types of work that we're going to be doing. So with goats, we tend to see them more interested in broadleaf plants and brush. They like to browse typically from shoulder level up, and their smaller mouths allow them to clip vegetation closely. They're pregnant for 5 months, which is an important fact to keep in mind as we go through the rest of these. Sheep tend to prefer a mix of different grasses and broadleaf plants. They tend to graze from, can you guys all still hear me? I just lost power.
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. The wonders of living in the foothills. But sheep tend to graze from shoulder level down. Can also clip vegetation pretty closely, and they are also pregnant for 5 months. And the power's back on. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about cattle as well. And I think there is definitely a role for cows in targeted grazing systems, particularly where we're worried about invasive grass species or some other broadleaf plants. But they do tend to graze from the shoulder level down, although there are some cattle here in the Sierra foothills on the west slope that will eat a lot of deer brush. And they do take bigger bites. I think the main difference here, besides those physiological differences, is the gestation period. And if your main product is selling a calf, it's difficult to find a time when that mother cow doesn't need optimal nutrition. And so I think that's that's an important factor to think about where we're going to use cattle for targeted grazing. It needs to be pretty specific in terms of the class of animal that we're going to use. So again, just some thoughts about using the right critter in terms of dietary preferences and adaptations. Goats seem to have the ability to neutralize tannins more effectively in many cases, and so we can use them in brush, perhaps more than some of the other species. Um, I think the limitations and challenges for the small ruminants tend to be their susceptibility to predators. I think, not that I would tell my cattlemen friends this, but I think sheep and goats are probably more difficult to fence in many cases. Goats can tend to be a little less hardy in weather like we're getting right now in the foothills and require a little more attention to shelter and nutritional intake during wet weather. Sheep, if they're wool sheep, are going to need to be shorn annually. And I think on the cattle side of things, typically are going to require more expensive infrastructure in terms of handling facilities and fencing. And that longer gestation period limits their ability to handle nutritional stress. But we got all these animals. Are they actually going to eat the stuff that we're trying to manage? And what we do know about forages in California and about vegetation is that
Think we lost you, Dan.
maintenance level that animals need just to maintain body function. You guys still hear me okay?
We just got you back. We missed most of this slide or what you said when you got
Okay.
back.
Yeah, maybe you can
Thank
repeat
you.
that last sentence, Dan.
Yeah, so one of the things we know about annual vegetation in particular here in California is that palatability really declines as those species mature. So as the grasses are drying out, the time of year and stage of growth impact their nutritional value and their palatability. Are we still with you?
Yes.
Great. There are also a number of brush species in California that are highly palatable and nutritious at specific times of year. And some of the key ones here would be deciduous and wedge-leaf ceanothus, coyote brush, Himalayan blackberry, live and black oak. Yellow star thistle isn't a brush species, obviously, but can have some pretty good nutrition at specific times of year. And so that gives us a window to treat some of these broadleaf species as well. We're doing some work up above Georgetown at a research facility that UC has at Blodgett Forest, and finding that the high moisture content and low fiber content in some brush at that elevation may be a challenge in terms of uptake of key nutrients. And so we're still trying to work out what strategic things we can do to supplement those animals on those brush species to maintain function and maintain grazing. This is probably something that most of us know, but I think it's important to remember that livestock are not mastication machines. They typically can't handle decadent brush. Goats are not going to eat a 4-inch diameter stem of manzanita. They simply are not able to do that. And so we need to be realistic about what they're able to accomplish in terms of the growth stages of the plants. Timing is really critical. For example, with yellow star thistle, we want to hit that when it's just starting to bloom. If we hit it early, it's going to regrow. And if we hit it too much later, it's not going to be terribly palatable. So understanding those timing windows for the types of vegetation that we're managing is really important. There are some plants that have secondary compounds, tannic acids, or other types of compounds that make them less susceptible to grazing and browsing. We find with green and white leaf manzanita in the Sierra foothills that animals will girdle it, will bark it, but aren't terribly wild about the leaves during most of the year. We see similar patterns with coffeeberry and toyon. I've found and be interested what others have observed with poison oak, but there seems to be times with sheep that they'll eat every poison oak leaf they can get at, and other times when they won't graze it at all. And I suspect that's has something to do with the tannin levels in the poison oak as well. We also have observed that goats and sheep are usually better suited to grazing spiny plants, whether it's blackberries or thistles, when compared to cattle. And that's partly due to the physiology of their mouth structures, that they're able to nibble around those spines more effectively. It's really fun to watch a group of goats or sheep go into star thistle and bite all the seed heads off when they first go in. And I just can't imagine how they can handle those spines. I think the other thing that's a little different for targeted grazers than it might be for production focused grazing is that we do sometimes see some toxic plant issues. In particular, um, we see if animals are stressed a little bit nutritionally, or if we're really trying to treat all of the vegetation in a particular paddock, we can get some incidental intake of toxic plants, which can be problematic. And that's something that Rosie will talk about in a future workshop. Our three grazing impacts that we can manage, obviously, we can remove herbaceous material through grazing, and that's what most of us think about. But we're also able to use trampling and nutrient cycling to our advantage in a targeted grazing scenario. So if you think about the fire triangle in terms of fuel, oxygen, and heat, we can certainly use grazing to remove fuel, but we can also, through trampling, excuse me, we can reduce the amount of oxygen around that fuel bed, which can improve our ability to fight and deal with fire in that landscape. Nutrient cycling can also be an important impact in terms of adding nutrients to soils that may not be able to support more desirable vegetation. I think one of the things any of us have done targeted grazing have had to cope with is that many times folks don't know what to expect a landscape to look like post grazing, post targeted grazing. And so if your idea is that it's going to be down to bare mineral soil, or if it's going to look like somebody ran a mower over the vegetation, that's probably not realistic. And so part of the job of a targeted grazer, I think, is really to educate clients as to how that's working. I think the other piece that's maybe different for grazing as opposed to some of the other vegetation management tools is that we also want to be thinking about the vegetation we want on a site. In terms of perennial, native perennial grasses, more desirable brush species, those types of things we can manage for through the timing of grazing as much as we can manage against the undesirable things like yellow star thistle or Himalayan blackberries. So I think it's important to think about what you want in a site, maybe not necessarily what's there now. I did have someone on a project that I helped with here in the foothills remark after seeing the job that the goats had done on a particular property that, well, we're going to have to graze this again. It's all going to grow back. And that is very true. I think that's something that's different perhaps from mastication or herbicide application, is that we may be overgrazing with the idea that we're going to impact or graze a particular plant out of that site, but we're likely going to have to come in for multiple years to manage, in particular, weed loads or fuel loads. Sheep and goats, as well as cattle, may be somewhat non-selective. And so because of that, they may impact some of the vegetation that's not targeted as well. And so we need to prepare clients for that and manage the animals for that eventuality as well. And then lastly, I think grazing can work really well where other tools are too costly or inappropriate, or to prepare for other treatments. So we can certainly use targeted grazing to construct a fuel break where we might want to use fire in the future. We can do things with grazing in areas where maybe we can't get hand crews or equipment. So in terms of building a better grazer, there's a couple of things that we'll talk about in subsequent workshops, but genetics are really important. Most targeted grazers find that they can breed animals better than they can buy them. And by that, I mean those animals that are born and raised in your system are more likely to learn the forage preferences that their mothers have and be able to manage the vegetation that they're going to be exposed to. I think the other piece of this is it's so critical to be focused on animal health and well-being, not only in terms of the animal's own performance, but in many cases we're grazing out in public and getting multiple calls a day about a limping goat or a limping sheep is not something that is a productive use of your time and not something we want to show the public. And so I think really focusing on animal health, in particular in those public settings, is critical. Very briefly, we'll walk through the principles of managed grazing, in terms of production focused grazing. And we want to adjust our rest periods to match the growth rate of the plants. We want the shortest graze period possible while maintaining that adequate rest. We want high stock densities and the largest herd size possible. And we want to adjust our stocking rate to seasonal and annual changes in carrying capacity. When we flip that around to targeted grazing, we really do want to use that shortest graze period possible. And partly that's because we're getting paid to cover acres. And if we can cover the acres more quickly, we get more, we earn more income per day. We want to use the highest stock density possible to help animals understand that they need to eat all the plants in front of them, not just their favorites. We can actually increase the uniformity of grazing by increasing that stock density. And we can also increase the impact of other grazing impacts like trampling. Again, largest herd size is important here as well, because we are trying to get across the acres as quickly as possible. I think in light of that, it's important to think about what the goals are for a particular project. Are you removing fine fuels? Are you maintaining a fuel break or other types of woody vegetation? Are you trying to control invasive weeds? Are there other types of things that you're trying to do in terms of the goals of the project? Generally, I think we find that more intensive management will yield more desirable results. Just turning them out and coming back in a month is probably not the type of management that will keep your clients happy. But the day-to-day attention to detail and moving animals across the landscape more intensively will yield those more desirable results. More intensity often means more time and expense, but it also may mean more revenue on the revenue side of things as well. I imagine Beth will talk a little bit about some of those challenges. And then, as I said, you really want to cover the acreage as quickly as you can. Infrastructure, typically you're going to be asked to bring everything you need to a job: fencing, water, predator protection, loading facilities. If you're using a herder, a camp for the herder. Access to stock water is the biggest factor to consider in looking at a job, in my opinion. Hauling water can be done, but it's time consuming. And so thinking about that early on. And then if you're thinking about getting started, what experience do you have caring for livestock? Do you have experience with electric fence? Do you have experience in equipment to haul water? Where are the animals going to be when they aren't working? I think that's a really important consideration. You don't put them in the shed and lock the shed until the next grazing season. And then in terms of the economics of targeted grazing, you've got the investment in animals, infrastructure, equipment, and knowledge. You will have a variety of sources of revenue, but largely grazing contracts. Your direct costs, which are those costs which vary with the number of animals that you're operating or the acres treated, are things like vet costs and feed costs. There may be others in there as you develop your own budgets. And then the overhead costs associated with that operation are largely fixed. Somebody's still going to have to take care of the animals, whether there's 10 animals or 10 hundred. And so that labor cost is an overhead. Most operations have some kind of home base that they go to for lambing or kidding or for just to keep animals healthy. That land base is an overhead as well. So, a couple of takeaways, and we'll get to Beth. Um, I think the main takeaway here is that it really requires targeted grazing requires a shift from livestock production to grazing for landscape goals. And that's a really important piece of what I hope you take away from tonight. We try to incorporate all of the grazing impacts. We remove vegetation, we trample it, we cycle the nutrients in that system to achieve fewer vegetation management goals. We can complement other vegetation management goals. Our grazing can be highly effective after mastication. It can be effective in annually removing fine fuels. And then it's often not a one-time treatment, that it requires an ongoing commitment to management. And I think as grazers, we can help our clients understand that. But if we're hiring targeted grazers, I think it's also really important to understand that that particular site didn't get to where it is today after just 1 year of not being managed. And so it may take multiple years of managing with grazing to get it into a more desirable condition. This is the reading assignment, and we'll send out links to this tomorrow. But additional reading out of the original targeted grazing handbook that I think will help with some of these concepts. And if you really have trouble sleeping, here's some additional reading that I will send the slide set to you as well on these. And that's how to track me down. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And are there any questions briefly? Otherwise, we'll ask Beth to share her slides. Any questions before we go on? Always good to talk right after dinner. Everybody's ready for a nap. That's good. All right, Beth, why don't we turn it over to you?
All right. Thank you, Dan. It was nice to see a recap of the last 20 years of my discovery. Lots of things that I've learned along the way, which I'm going to talk about tonight. So yeah, my name is Beth Reynolds, and introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm going to share tonight a little bit about my journey of becoming a targeted grazer. I've been doing targeted grazing since 2003, and have done a lot of things. So just going to share my experience and hope that it's helpful in guiding you guys on your journey, whether you're interested in doing it or if it's something you are just trying to learn about. Okay, so I started in 2005. Interestingly, I went to a browsing academy held by a gal named Ann Paschel. It was put on through UC Extension, and I learned about targeted grazing and everything that was involved with it. If any of you know her, she's very passionate, and so she instilled in me a strong sense of what this work entailed and the livestock management that would be required of it. Fortunately, my background, I did grow up raising goats, dairy goats in 4-H. So I did have 10 years of experience with them. I got a degree from Cal Poly, which is where I now teach, and animal science was my major. I minored in range management, and it was only because I was supposed to be pre-vet, and we had to do a necropsy on a horse, and I left the class early and told my advisor I did not want to be a vet. What else can I do with my degree? And so I went into range management, and come to find out it was all meant to be. Um, so In 2003, I got started with a gentleman that had some goats in San Luis Obispo. He really wasn't knowledgeable about grazing. He had 5 border collies and was just using the goats to work his dogs daily. But he was grazing and he had contracts with the city, and I worked with him as a student and ended up buying his didn't really buy his operation. I bought his equipment. So I bought his dog, his goats, and truck and trailer. And then from there, I tried to get into grazing as a full-time job after I graduated. Um, I did not have guard dogs when I started. He also was very adamant that electric fencing does not work. We use T-posts and wire fence, and fortunately, I learned early on how to use electric fence, and it can hold in goats, but in the beginning, it was a little rough. Um, my beginnings were a little difficult because of capital investment that was needed. I remember this day oh so well, but having equipment that you need is really helpful. I mean, Dan just mentioned hauling water, and so we tried to make do with a water tank my neighbor had on this little metal stand, and found a old trailer with a wood platform, and obviously it didn't hold. But I think the investment that's needed to really start the business, and have the equipment you need to effectively run an operation is something to really plan out. And I eventually did that over time, but definitely should have been more focus when I first got started. Um, Desperate times. So when I started 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of targeted grazing, at least in my county. And so I worked with the city. I made like $3,000 a year with them. I did residential jobs and eventually was willing to do birthday parties with baby goats. And so I've come a long way. You couldn't pay me $1,000 to do a birthday at this point. I did enough of them, and yeah, just not what I want to do with my animals. Um, Over the years, really just learning to build your skill set. I did not grow up really being an ag person other than having my dairy goats, but I like didn't know how to drive a truck and trailer. I didn't know how to build stuff, how to grind through metal. Howard here in this photo is the gentleman that taught me all those things. And so I really want to stress the importance of having a community of people that can help you learn, and also not feeling restricted by what you don't know. My parents both were administrators, and so they really didn't know how to operate equipment, drive tractors, all the things that you eventually learn. And so I've very grateful for the people that around me that taught me along the way and helped me along the way. On the right here is my mother, still bottle feeding today. She doesn't handle as many, but she's 73 and is game for 2 to 5 at a time. So I take her my intensive care patients and then get them back and give her the new ones once she's got them on a good start. So, um, just having a community is super helpful. So most of my work was focused on residential. So I did either individual people's backyards. I mostly had goats. I had a little bit of sheep, like 10 sheep. But that 150 goats I started with was kind of my capacity for the first 5 or 6 years. I couldn't really handle anymore, and I didn't have the job scale to justify it. I worked by myself, did everything, and so it just seemed like the scale that it could be. But ch things have changed. So in 2013 was a big year for me. I went to the Society of Range Management annual meeting, and my eyes were opened to this whole world of grazers. I went up there and they had a targeted grazing tour, and we were able to go out and see some projects up in the Sacramento area. And I happened to sit in the back of the van with some people on the targeted grazing committee. And they asked me what I do, and I told them what I do. And they were academics that really studied targeted grazing, and they were quite excited by my real world experience. So they asked me to join their committee meeting that was later that day. And I was asked to immediately serve as a chair-elect in the committee. So I kind of got thrown into targeted grazing in that way through the society, and it really opened my eyes to how much was going on that I just didn't know about. Because, like I said, I think in San Luis Obispo County it was kind of a bubble, and I just didn't realize that there were people up in the Bay Area that were really successful at this. And research that had been done. I mean, I definitely was struggling with some of the plant species, coyote brush, black sage, and just not understanding why the goats wouldn't eat it. And so learning the science behind that was really fascinating. So definitely important to keep your eyes open, keep learning. Um, and so, yeah, as the years went on, a lot of things happened. I tried partnership with somebody. One of my students at Cal Poly was really interested. She did it for 2 years and then decided that it wasn't her lifestyle. She wanted more time with her family. And so I was fortunate to find Jose, who's worked with me for 5 years now. And he loves it. He loves building fence. He builds electric fencing every day. He thinks it's great work. He likes that he stays in shape. And it it all worked out for the better. But it definitely is hard to find people that want to do this kind of work and are willing to work um, in those conditions. This scene is a great example. Just we're usually on steep terrain. We often are out on, hot days. There's yellow jackets, there's rattlesnakes. And so there's allergies, there's things I just didn't realize I'm okay with, but working with other people became apparent. So definitely grateful for Jose coming into things. So my herd really grew. I definitely started growing at some point as I think more jobs kind of came on board, and the partnership kind of spurred a need for growth. Um, so we started building our herd. We had basically no sale of meat animals for 5 years. All of the kid crops we kept. So does and wethers we just held on to build the herd. Um, and I now have about 2,000. I do have sheep as well. I I'm very partial to goats, but I definitely appreciate the ease of sheep. They're not so difficult. They're just not. They don't ask a lot of questions. They're easier to fence for sure. They are hair sheep. I'm not really into the wool and the shearing and all that, but This is a Barbado sheep, and then Dorper ever since. But I really appreciate grazing them with goats. I think the flurd works really well on a lot of the fuel management jobs that we do. The goats can do a great job, but I think the sheep have their place. So. Still, really need a lot of young people. I'm 43 now and just can't do all the work that I used to do. So, building a community of people that love working with their hands. I'm fortunate to work at the university. I'm surrounded by a lot of students that, want to come out on the weekends and get dirty and, castrate 400 goats and vaccinate 800 goats, and they just love it. Really good memories for them. So it's a win-win. But, having facilities, buying equipment to help you do this stuff is I've made improvements, but there's still just a lot more as I continue to grow that I do need to do. On the right side is my livestock trailer. So for forever, I've just hauled with a livestock trailer. Um, we can fit 50 to 70 animals. At some point, I did a vineyard that was like an hour away, and I did the math on hauling 300 sheep, 50 at a time, an hour away, wear and tear on my truck. And then I called this big rig driver and it was half the cost. So, and I didn't realize that. So I think just talking to people and understanding a sense of like what your options are is super important. But having the double deck trailer is helpful. Having a semi with 4 floors is really helpful. And it's just more, I think, easy on the animals. They, run up the ramp, they get to their place, they're all together. It's not a super stressed out long day. So those are just some growth areas. I don't own a big rig. I'm not there yet. I just hire them out, but dogs. Dogs are a big part of this. Let's see. 3 of these dogs in this photo are useful. Um, so definitely border collies are where I got started with Howard. He was very passionate about he did stock dog trials. So I learned from somebody who really knew stockmanship using a border collie, a whistle. We would herd goats because, again, he didn't believe in electric fencing. So some of our projects actually for me was over the summer, I would herd 100 goats for 6 hours a day with 2 border collies, and we'd sit them down and hold them in areas and tell them, hey, you need to eat this brush patch. And then we'd go to the grass area and kind of like have this working relationship with this herd, and 2 border collies that would sit for an hour at a time in one position and only work if I gave them a command. And so I think that's something I've really enjoyed, and they're just absolutely essential. The little This little meatloaf on the right is Moose. She's really just my emotional support animal. But she's helpful too, surprisingly, as a pound dog. She does drive pretty well. She'll get behind him and push him pretty steady. She's not a little terror. So some dogs do have some herding skills you'd be surprised by. So my business in the beginning, as I mentioned, really focused on fire prevention. I did some work for the city for flood control, but there's definitely just such a change in the industry now with soil health, using animals on the landscape for other purposes. And so grazing vineyards has definitely been a new addition to our our portfolio. I mean, I live on the central coast of California, so we have Paso Robles and Edna Valley, which have a lot of vineyards. Um, and I think as the years have gone on, like my style of grazing has changed. Working for backyard homeowner types to working with vineyard managers to working with biologists in the city. There's just different levels of comfort with grazing, and I've just kind of learned to adapt, based on what people want and honestly what I think is needed. Um, so this is an example of a flurd. So the sheep and the goats really complement each other well, depending on the type of job. If there's a lot of grass, I go really heavy on sheep, like 70% sheep. But most of the time it's 50-50. Um, Definitely, as you guys learn from other parts of this course, like the type of animal, sheep or goat, cattle, also the age class. So I try to bring animals back to the same job sites every year. So like each group has kind of a set route. So they're familiar with the moves and the vegetation. I think the flurd works really well. They used to be, when I first did the flurd, they were really segregated. Like the goats totally dominate the sheep and like were mean to them, like really mean to them. Now I do it more often where the lambs grow up with the kid crop and they don't differentiate. They're much more inclusive. So if you're going through that, they will figure it out, but um, I've done some post-fire grazing, and I'd like to do more of this. I really think this is a great opportunity, looking forward for the industry. Just using grazing in addition to other tools. I think after a fire with the change in plant community, grazing can be used very effectively to control some of the invasive weeds that might come in and the flashy fine fuels that usually get established. Um, this project is very interesting. Our target was a ceanothus, wild lilac, and we went in 4 years after a fire, and they basically didn't eat the brush. Whatever they ate was like not noticeable. I mean, they ate a few leaves, they girdled a stem, but it was a big learning curve for them. They hadn't been in so much of it. They had been exposed to it, but not a wall of 6 foot tall ceanothus. And I was just so confident that they were going to eat it. So 20 years later, I'm still learning. Um, and then funny enough, they loved this char pile. They all loved laying around in the pile burns pits, and this is where they made a bunch of biochar. I'm not really sure the hotness of it. It was black, so hot, or dusty, and I don't know, maybe helped them with lice or something, but yeah, there's a lot to learn from them. One of my projects now that really I think has spurred my focus is a project for the city of Paso. It's the most large scale project I've done. Um, I, have not really left San Luis Obispo County just because my family's here. I do have a job at the university, but I never really wanted to just get on the road in a big rig and travel with my goats. I kind of wanted to be local. So within the county, I didn't have a lot of large scale projects. I think the biggest one I did before this was 10 acres. So this was 100 acres. We started in 2021, and we've done this project ever since. And I really had to increase my herd size to achieve the goals of this project. So it's a riverbed. It is about 300 acres within the city limits. The hardest thing is the acres per day. So we come in when things are just starting to dry out. This grass in this top photo is ripgut brome, and it's not palatable. The seed heads are raspy, and it's called ripgut for a reason. They have figured out how to eat it, but I'm always like chasing the ripgut, trying to get it knocked down before it's totally not palatable. Um, but the focus of this project is fire prevention. And so we start as soon as we can based on the Regional Water Quality Control Board's timeline. We're not allowed to be up there in any rain event. But we also need to cover the acreage before a significant fire risk is present. So basically 100 acres within 4 to 6 weeks. I started with 300. I now usually am at about 1,400 animals on this project. And every year I try to do it better. I started in the south this last year and went north because it dries out fast in the south and it's still really green in the north. I figured out I can go faster. Um, Sheep and goats for sure. Again, the flurd. I've done both sides of the river at the same time. Um, I don't know. It's kind of a fun challenge to constantly figure out how to do the same project better and better. Um, but it's the one reason that my herd has really grown, is to achieve this project. And it's, I think, the most rewarding. There's been a lot of great workshops we've done up with this project. The battalion chief I work with is a really good advocate for grazing. He's was a hotshot firefighter for 20 years, so he's very well versed in wildland fire. And there's just a lot of unique environmental impacts to this project, and the permits that are needed make it kind of an exciting challenge for me. So I'm very grateful for that. This is a map on the right. These are all bird nests that have been identified. So we have a biologist that go ahead of us and identify buffers. And then we have to figure out this is me doodling on my phone, different pens that we're gonna do. So I think it's a good job for me at this point. Um, Let me see if I can do this time lapse. Um, Time lapse, no. It's just okay, hold on. Okay, here's my Zoom.
Beth, while you're figuring that out, there was a question about the breed of goats that you run.
Um, I love Kikos. They're really good mothers, really good hardiness that I appreciate. But honestly, I've just tried a little bit of everything. Spanish, boar goat, Kiko goat. I got some dairy goats at one point. Um, so they're kind of a mix. I mean, if you're into meat production, boar goat is the way to go. But man, those Kikos are just really good moms, and it's just so much easier than boar goats. So yeah, I would say boar Kiko is really what I go for. Okay, I'm gonna share.
Other questions for Beth? Are you able to pull that out,
Yeah.
Beth?
Yeah, I'm gonna do this time lapse. It's really cool.
Great.
Okay. Um, okay. Play.
One Ozempic. What was that?
So this is 300 goats on half an acre for 1 hour. I'm just always mesmerized by it. And in the riverbed in Paso. I've never noticed how methodical they graze. If you watch like one goat, like they're getting after it. It's very competitive.
And Beth, is that a function of the animal density in part? Is that competition partly because you've got high densities?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think competition is huge.
It's a great
But
video.
yeah, there's like one stand in the middle I always watch. It was a bunch of dried mustard, and it's they kind of like the seed heads, but the stems aren't. But you can just watch a few get after it, and it's pretty remarkable how quickly they take it down. And so we did that time lapse, and you know I think I realized at that point that to really scale my business and to do the type of work I wanted to do for the city of Paso, I really had to grow my herd. And so we're doing a lot of work for them, and it's expanded to some other areas within the city, and hoping to work with some of the other neighboring cities as well to kind of keep growing the opportunity there. But it's been very well received. Um, so yeah. And then other than that, I don't know. Eventually I got put on this this magazine cover. Um, and they came out to the riverbed, and it was just really cool. For 20 years of being a grazer, this is a local magazine, but yeah, a lot of people reach out to me that knew me when I first got started, or I mean, I used to graze people's backyards for $150. And so it was just like this article coming out. I just reconnected with all these people that had supported me, that were just, I couldn't have done it without all of them. And it just really lit me up to be motivated to persevere when you really feel something, when you really want it to work, it can. But yeah, anyways, here's my info. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm supposed to tell you guys a few things about things I wish I knew. Um, so let me stop sharing.
And we'll share your information
Okay.
in the email tomorrow too.
Yeah. Um, So things, I guess, as a targeted grazer, for sure, the animal husbandry, I think, is really critical. I mentioned just starting out with dairy goats, gave me some background. Okay, but dairy goats is very different from, kidding out in a pasture and all that. But I had a good veterinarian. I understood, some basic vet skills, and then just keep learning. You make mistakes. I still make mistakes. But just knowing that it's something that you really have to put into focus, is that you're managing land, but you're using a living being to do that. And so I see that a lot where people struggle with that, or they're just not prioritizing that. And I've learned to not do jobs that I don't think are good for my animals, or the timing of it, like they're pregnant and I don't want them eating, tumbleweeds when they're pregnant. I put a lot of priority to that, and I didn't used to. They were fine, but I just think that they do a lot better. Um, Other things, just definitely kind of touched on this, but like just know that, there's so much of an industry now. I mean, we actually have targeted grazing handbooks, we have research, we have a whole network of grazers, there's workshops going on. Um, there's all sizes of grazers. Like I was the main person in San Luis Obispo County for a long time. And now there's, maybe 6 people in San Luis Obispo that do targeted grazing, and they might have 300 sheep, they might have 10 sheep. But they are, helpful, and, guard dog gets out, I know who I can call, or, looking for a buck or need an energizer because mine just died. It's good to have a network of people around you that you can lean on. Um, Other than that, I think most of all, like the business side to it is, you know, depending on what you're doing with targeted grazing, if you are just like retired and looking for something to get out and do, maybe it's not as important. I think for me, graduating from college and then trying to earn a living, it was I remember a lot of times taking a jar of coins to the coin machine to pay rent. It was definitely a really hard road, and I was too proud to ask for money from my parents. And so I wish that I got tied in with the Small Business Administration, but even then, getting financial numbers that are realistic, like you can plan out a business, but if you don't know like what you can sell your goats for, whether they're a month old or 6 months old, it's really hard to plan for that. And so I think more of that stuff is talked about in the industry. And I think that's really critical, is trying to do some financial planning, cash flow, understanding cash flow. Um, yeah. Okay. Questions.
Couple of
Uh,
questions in the chat there.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, they love belt. Oh, yeah. Okay, Ashley, yeah, you can contact me about your 30 acres. Go full unit removing fencing. So yeah, our fencing at this point is the electric netting. And we just fence it in small sections. I mean, most of our jobs are moving daily, if not every 4 days. Yeah, I mean, some of the projects can handle 4-day pens, but a lot of our like really good, clean fire fuel management are daily moves. Some of the Paso project is half days. So I do have insurance. I mean, I have general liability that is specific to what I do. Other than that, just, my auto business policy. But a general liability policy, farm policy is helpful. There's lots of agents that can help with that. But most of the projects, you will be required to have an insurance policy in place, liability. And then they usually set the limits. Most of my projects were 1 million per occurrence, um, which is not, so I pay maybe for that, I paid maybe $1,500 a year for that. Now with the city of Paso, it's 3 million per occurrence. So I pay about 4,000 a year on liability. So it's not awful, but it's definitely needed. I've
Beth,
as
did you find you had to explain to your insurance agent what you did?
So, yes, and they audit me, and I don't think they have a clue what I do. I don't think they really know. I tell them that I'm next to the freeway. because I feel like I need to confess. But they just think it's so cute. It's just like some lady back east that just thinks like my business is so cool, and I don't know. I fortunately do everything I can to never file an insurance claim. I know this from my auto policy. I am not a bad driver, but I've definitely been in several accidents, and it gets really difficult to get insurance. So, I really try to, you know, go buy people plants, buy them a nice apple tree if my goats get in their yard. I have just written a couple checks. Nothing crazy, but I think in general it's good to have it if you need it, but try not to use it kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the insurance thing is definitely a good thing to talk about. I've never had livestock insurance either, and unfortunately, I had 117 goats stolen last year. And I had no recourse for that. I contacted the police, they did an investigation. Unfortunately, because it wasn't caught on camera and I didn't get the license plate, there's nothing they can do. So I think I'm going to be getting some sort of policy to help with that. Yeah.
I've found in my business sometimes it was hard to convince the police that kids running sheep through the fence was probably something that the kids should not be doing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think sometimes working with law enforcement can be challenging just because they don't understand the business at all.
Yeah.
We have time for one or two more questions. If anybody has any questions for Beth. Well, Beth, thank you. This is really, really helpful and a great way to kick off the short course. Thank you for
Yeah.
all the
Thanks for
time
having
and
me.
effort and thought.
Yeah. It was great. Happy to share.
And we will share, we are recording each of these webinars, so we will share the recording with folks. I will share my slides, and Beth, would you be willing to share your slides with folks
Yeah,
as
sure.
well?
Yeah.
That'd be great. And we'll be back here next week at the same time, 6 o'clock. Next week, we're going to learn a little bit more about assessing landscapes and thinking about fuel reduction in particular with a couple of folks from UC. So unless there's any last minute questions, those of you that still have power, enjoy dinner cooked on a real stove. I'm going to go put soup on my wood stove tonight.